said. I'm feeling really good tonight. We're going to have a good presentation. I had a good night's sleep. I had lots of coffee this morning. But my ace in the hole are a pair of new socks.
Oh.
And let me explain. I got a pair of new socks, and they're actually labeled left and right. I mean, they really are.
Okay, let's see them.
Well, no, I can show you later, but they've got embroidered L and R on them. So tonight, just to be edgy, I'm wearing the left sock on my right foot and the right sock on my left
Are
foot.
you going to have her follow you?
So, well, she doesn't have to follow me for that. She doesn't have to follow me for that.
Is that why you're talking funny?
You rebel, you rebel.
I am a wild and crazy guy.
That's sugar from Halloween candy too, right?
Yeah. Okay, so tonight, we're going to pick up where we left off last week with the American Civil War, and more specifically, not the Civil War itself, but in fact, the seeds of destruction, the events that led to the Civil War. We're covering an 80-year period in 2 weeks. Last week, we covered the first 40, from 1776 to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and we're going to do a very brief review to catch up on that, and then we'll pick it up from the Compromise of 1820 and move it forward. This is, as I say, part 2. And necessarily, I mean, it goes without saying that in covering tonight 40 years in about 45 minutes, it's going to be a very blanket sort of thing. I'm going to make a lot of general statements. If you really dig into it, of course, like anything else in history or life, the details are incredibly more nuanced, but we're not going to worry about that tonight. So you catch the trend and the basic idea of what led the United States to the catastrophe that almost shattered the country into at least 2 and possibly as many as 5 different countries had the Civil War gone a different way. So the United States, by way of review, 1776, 13 relatively sovereign colonies to become states along the eastern seaboard of North America, and within the next 80 years or so, they transformed into about 35 states scattered halfway across the continent, with territory owned even beyond that through the Louisiana Purchase and other acquisitions. Last week we talked about the demographic changes that occurred that essentially established 2 different countries, as it were. Certainly 2 different cultures, North versus South. Not just geographically, but intrinsically, in the way they lived, the way they thought, the way they were composed. These changes scattered across, here I list just 5, once again, a generalization, but the lifestyle in the North was very much centered around factories because they got into the Industrial Revolution in a big way, and that generated large cities. The South stayed very farm-like because they were blessed with not only good quality soil, but also wonderful temperatures, and they were able to grow, among other things, cotton. The people remained primarily English or those that had settled the country. Here in the North, they had a large influx of immigrants coming in, to the tune of about 300,000 every year for a 10-year period from 1844 to 1854. People were flooding in, looking to catch the wave, to grab the golden ring, to be part of this great experiment that they heard about in Europe, where conditions were less than optimal, they were crowded, they were ugly, they were lacking in freedom. They had an opportunity and they made the jump and came across the Atlantic to join. Once again, the economy, industry in the North, cotton in the South. They grew other things, but cotton was by far the #1 product in the South. It was not only some of the best cotton in the world, but it was the most in demand. Both France and England had huge textile industries. They didn't grow cotton themselves, but they could take the cotton as much as the South would grow and weave it into textiles as a major product of both the French and the English. Government participation was accordingly. New industries needed the protection of tariffs. So the North enjoyed having a government step between them and competing industries abroad. The South, they didn't need any help to sell their cotton. They saw the North, or they saw the central government as interlopers. And then finally, the idea of slavery. Slavery had existed on the North American continent for 200 years. In 1619, there had been slaves in the United States, as elsewhere. But by the mid-1800s, slavery had all but disappeared in Western-style countries, in Western-style governments. By 1860, in fact, only two major Western countries still had slaves, the United States and Russia, through their serfs. And by 1862, even the Russians had freed the serfs. So slavery was an aberration that existed in the United States, home of the brave, land of the free, and it was becoming increasingly a problem in the relations between North and South. Cotton really drove the actions of the South, for the reasons that I pointed out. They grew a great deal of it, and because of it, they became very dependent upon the slaves as a labor force to harvest it. The North had industry. The North was able to satisfy their need for people to occupy the industries and the factories through the immigrants that were coming across. The South had the institution, the peculiar institution of slavery, which they had, and they continued to become deeper and deeper involved as the slaves harvested the cotton. The cotton provided great amounts of money to the Southern industry, the Southern economy, in increasing value until by 1860, they represented nearly 100% of the South's economy. And to change out slaves for workers at that point would have been very disruptive. The South said, this is a matter of individual state sovereignty. We will decide when to do it, not the central government. This became the crux of an issue between North and South. Central government versus state sovereignty. We all know the 10th Amendment says if it is not specifically said to belong to the federal government, it is reserved to the states. Well, slavery, although it had been around for 200 years and had been discussed in the Declaration of, or it had been discussed during the Declaration of Independence, it had been discussed during the writing of the Constitution, it nowhere showed up in either of those two documents because it was such an incendiary issue. Therefore, the Southern states said, up to us to decide. North said, this is an abomination. What you're going to see tonight is how the tempers flared, heated, became white hot until 1860. Abolition versus slavery played out on the chessboard of the American continent. The states were represented in Congress. Congress made the laws. As long as the South and the North maintained an even number of states and representatives on either side, the South could keep the North at bay from passing any laws to eliminate slavery. So every time states came into the Union, it was a highly contentious issue, one that was fought over in the halls of Congress to decide whether or not it would come in free or slave. This began the country on a long upward slope towards war. We talked about the Missouri Compromise towards the end of last week. In this case, the state of Missouri came in as a slave state. But the provision given to the North was that an imaginary line would be drawn across the southern border of Missouri and across the continent, saying that in the future, any state formed to the North would be free, to the South would be slave. Obviously, the South is a smaller area, and it was widely recognized by many who echoed and understood the words of John Quincy Adams, former president and now member of Congress, who said, "This is not over. This is the beginning of a long and tortuous path in American history." That's where we left off last week. Any questions at that point? All right. Feeling my socks.
Stop working.
Okay, here we go. Missouri Compromise. For the next 30 years, there were no new states added to the country. There were a great many issues that were discussed. There were famous men like Henry Clay or Daniel Webster that discussed and fought with words in Congress over the issue of slavery and abolition. But the first time that states actually came to be included or added to the United States came some 30 years later in 1850. The Compromise of 1850 dealt with a recent event in which the country of Texas had separated from the country of Mexico and petitioned the United States to become part of the United States. A war was fought from 1846 to 1848, American-Mexican. The United States won and gained property. They gained Texas, they gained New Mexico, they gained Utah, and they gained California. Now, Texas was obviously below the Missouri Compromise line, so this was an easy call. Texas would come in as a slave state. Now, California, even though it was bisected by the line, it was occupied by people who did not want slavery, so it came in as a free state. The other two, Utah and New Mexico, would not even approach statehood until many years later, towards the end of the 19th century and as late as, I think, 1912 for New Mexico. But the idea was proffered by Congress that the people decide when the time comes, they would decide whether or not they would come in as free or slave. This concept was known as popular sovereignty, the leadership or the ownership of the people to decide. It more or less met the constitutional parameters, and so that was advanced and given that opportunity to both of those territories, and they ran with it for many, many years, well past the Civil War. But there were two other provisions that were part of the Compromise of 1850. First of all, here in Washington, D.C., since the founding of the city itself in the early 1800s, there had been slave traffic, slave auctions held right within range of the White House. This was considered distasteful to the abolitionists. And as part of the Compromise of 1850, it was declared that there would be no more slave auctions within the precinct of District of Columbia. So the North got something. The South has to get something in return. And what they got was a law which declared, if I lose property, you are bound to return it to me. If I drop my wallet and you find it, now you might take all the money, but you are bound to return the wallet to me. It is my property. The South said slaves are property. We have paid for them. We own them. For many, many years, slaves had run away from the South and gone to the North and made lives for themselves up north as free men. The South wanted them back. Congress passed what was known as the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850. And it quite simply said, if a slave is identified up north, no matter how long, there is no statute of limitations, they are to be returned to the South. A few years back, there was a movie called 12 Years a Slave, you might have seen. That pointed out one of the great problems with the Fugitive Slave Act, because sometimes a reward was given whether the person had been a slave or not. And so there were free black men that were sometimes snatched up by press gangs and carried back down to the South and sold back to slavery. The idea was hateful and created no goodwill between North and South. Harry Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which further dramatized the plight of the black people in the South and in the North trying to run away from slavery. It demonized the Southerners to the point where they said, we are not all that bad. But nevertheless, the hatred grew between North and South because of such things. The Compromise of 1850 was good for only about 4 more years. In 1854, another pair of territories petitioned for statehood, leading to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The territories of Kansas and Nebraska were part of the old Louisiana Territory purchased by Jefferson back in 1803. It was long-held territory. By 1854, they are ready to come into the United States as individual states. Well, the Missouri Compromise line obviously says that they are going to be free states. But the South didn't like that. It would clearly upset the balance in Congress. With the North gaining additional free states, they would gain the votes, they would gain the power, they could pass laws, they could declare slavery illegal throughout the United States. So there was a great deal of pushback. It appeared that nothing would break the compromise until this guy came along. This is Stephen Douglas of Illinois. He probably stood about 5'4", 5'5", a relatively small man, but a giant in Congress. In fact, he was known as the Little Giant. He was incredibly powerful in maneuvering through the halls of Congress and marshaling the forces of the Democratic Party to whatever he wanted. He was indeed a little giant. And in 1854, Stephen Douglas wanted something. He wanted this. Not just a train, not just any train, an entire railroad. See, in 1854, the United States was considering building a railroad. Railroads, kind of like thread stitching together clothing, railroads were stitching together the country in 1854. And the plan was to build a railroad from the occupied East all the way out to California. Well, which way to go is the question. Now, certainly, it could come from the south. Relatively level, the mountains are not nearly as significant as further north, and it could come right up into California. Stephen Douglas didn't want that. You might have noticed Stephen Douglas was from Illinois. Stephen Douglas wanted the train to start in Chicago, because that way, Chicago, in his state of Illinois, would become powerful and wealthy, and he, by extension, would become powerful and wealthy. Things don't change. He wanted that railroad to run from Chicago all the way across, keep up with me, to California. And the Kansas and Nebraska loggerhead appeared to offer an opportunity for him to work some political magic. He came forward and he proposed the following. What we're going to do is eliminate that line. Gone. Forget it. And what we will insert instead is what we did in Utah and New Mexico. And we're going to say popular sovereignty in Kansas and in Nebraska. Let the people decide. Sounds great. Let the people decide. Unintended consequences are a real pisser. And what happened in Kansas and Nebraska truly was a pisser. Although there was a great deal of interest in turning these states to slave states, there was an equally adamant decision or feeling from northern states to not let them go slave. So they decided the simple matter is to infiltrate the territories with people who will vote the right way, with compelling arguments. Well, their compelling arguments looked a little like this. That, my friends, is a compelling argument. The territories were flooded with both northern and southern sympathizers with a great deal of weapons like this, and worse, if there could be worse. And they promptly started going into enclaves of the opposition and convincing them they got the wrong idea. For example, a group of southern pro-slavery groups went into Lawrence, Kansas in 1856, and they sacked it, destroyed the town, killed a number of people, just destroyed the area. The North was not going to stand for that. They sent in their own groups, represented perhaps ideally by this crazy-eyed guy. This is John Brown. He's a New York farmer, deeply religious, deeply anti-slavery. He believed the Word of God spoke through his actions. And he got his sons together, and a group of them went out to Kansas to proselytize, that is, convince the slave owners that slavery was bad. And they did it in much the same way that happened in Lawrence, Kansas. In 1856, a camp along Potawatomi Creek was attacked by John Brown and his crew with broadswords as well as rifles, and they killed 4 pro-slavery men. This continued in large picture across the entire territory of Kansas and Nebraska. In fact, it continued through the Civil War. If you've seen Outlaw Josie Wales, you get an idea of the brutality of the people and the sheer, anything goes. Kansas and Nebraska soon became known by a new name, Bloody Kansas. It was a national embarrassment. It was open warfare, as bad as anything we've ever seen in our history. And there seemed to be no stopping it. The military could not go in and stop it. Either side could not muster enough strength to stop the other. So it just went on in bloody year after bloody year. About 2 years before this, the forces of the eastern part of the United States, there were several groups that were anti-slavery. And they weren't all from one party. In fact, they came from several groups. The 4 major ones would be the Whig Party. The Whigs were a national party that represented the Federalists earlier on in the American history. John Adams, for example, was a Whig. Jefferson was a Democrat Republican. The Whigs were against slavery, as were the abolitionists, highly against slavery, single-mindedly so. The anti-Nebraska Democrats, there were members of the Democratic Party that were against slavery. And finally, the Know-Nothings. This was a group that was formed of people who were staunchly Native American. You might compare them to the Klan. They were very much in favor of white America for white people, no Catholics, no blacks, no slavery, just make it very, very white. Because it was a controversial stand, they might be approached by someone who says, "What do you know about this?" And their response was, "I know nothing." So they became known as the Know-Nothings. They were sort of known, but they were somewhat secretive. Anyway, these 4 groups recognized that as individual groups, they were small potatoes. They could not compete on a national level and gain a significant following, but united against slavery, they might be able to pull together some power. And so in 1854, these 4 groups, and perhaps others, did in fact coalesce. They tossed away their earlier titles, and they became known as Republicans. That was the birth of the Republican Party. United against slavery. United for abolition. One of the really, really vocal guys in this group was this guy. This is Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts. He is an abolitionist and powerful speaker. One day in the Senate, he decided to make some waves. And he referred to the co-sponsor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he said the following. Now, certainly, today, we see much worse than this. But back then, these are fighting words. You call a guy having a mistress who's a whore, them's fighting words. Now, Butler himself did not rise up to contest this. But this guy did. This is Preston Brooks. He's a representative from South Carolina. Oh, sorry. Preston Brooks is a representative from South Carolina. And oh, by the way, he is Senator Butler's cousin. So he gathers himself up one day after Sumner had made that speech. And he approaches Sumner sitting in the Senate chamber. The Senate chamber. And he says, "Sir, you have insulted my family. You have insulted my country. You have insulted me. Now, if you were a dog, well, I should just treat you as I would a dog." And with that, Brooks took his cane and beat Sumner senseless right on the floor of the Senate. He beat the bejesus out of him. Sumner, in fact, was hospitalized. He was crucially, critically injured. Brooks broke his cane over Sumner's head. And the people, as you can see in the background, have mixed reactions. Brooks was actually later presented a replacement cane by the Southern Caucus as a hero of the South. This was where the country was going. Now, a few years ago, I used to give this presentation, and I'd say, "Oh, I just can't imagine things being that bad."
Yeah, right.
Well, guess what?
Who knew?
Who knew? In 1857, the Supreme Court got in on the issue because of this man. This is Dred Scott. He is a slave. He's a slave of an army officer, as a matter of fact. And army officers are often moved around in their duties. This army officer took Dred Scott, his manservant, with him when he got moved to, I believe it was Minnesota. Well, Minnesota, not surprisingly, is not a slave state. Dred Scott, being a rather learned man, put two and two together and he says, "I'm a slave, but I'm in a state where slavery does not exist, therefore I am free." And he petitioned for his freedom. It went through the court systems. It went through many court systems. Nobody knew quite what to make of it, until it finally ended up on the Supreme Court of the United States, where in 1857, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, makes his declaration. And he says, African Americans are not human beings. All African Americans, not just slaves, freedmen, and there were freedmen, black Americans. But Taney declares the entire race of the black man is not equal and does not deserve any consideration in white courts. Well, he also says, by the way, slavery is legal everywhere. Minnesota, anywhere. The South rejoices. They've been freed of the Missouri Compromise line. They've been freed of everything that would have withheld slavery from expanding into the United States further west. Supreme Court said so. Enter Stephen Douglas again. In 1858, Stephen Douglas, Senator Douglas, is running for re-election to the United States Senate, as they do every 6 years. He is pretty much a shoo-in. He is a member of the Democratic Party, and he is well liked by the Democrats who hold a majority in the state of Illinois. It is perhaps because of such hubris that he decides to accept a challenge from an old friend of his. He is challenged to a series of debates, something we're used to now, but not so much back in 1858. But Stephen Douglas knows this guy. He's known him for many years. They used to work circuit court in Illinois together. In fact, word is they once both dated the same girl. Douglas takes him up on it, and they decide to have a series of debates across Illinois. I think 6 of them across the state. Now, Douglas should not have been so lackadaisical in underestimating his opponent, even though his opponent is kind of a goofy, country kind of guy. Because one day, the country kind of guy stands up and he says this. So I have a question. You see, I'm a little confused about your popular sovereignty and what the Supreme Court just said. Supreme Court says it's good everywhere, but popular sovereignty, which you propose for Kansas and Nebraska, says people can decide. So which is it? Can the people basically say the Supreme Court is wrong? Which is it? It's a great trap. It's kind of like, have you stopped beating your wife yet? There's no good answer that won't get Douglas into trouble. Because if he goes with the Supreme Court is right, he upsets a lot of his voters in Illinois who do not want slavery extended. On the other hand, if he says that popular sovereignty is right, he upsets the party at large, who had won a great victory from Tawney, saying that slavery was valid everywhere. He does what he needs to do to win the election in Illinois. Oh, and by the way, his opponent, you might recognize him, of course you do. His name is Abraham Lincoln. To which Douglas answered, the people decide. He wins his election. He is re-elected to the Senate. He has another 6 years. But the debates have not been in vain for Lincoln. They have catapulted Lincoln into the popular vision throughout the country as a man who is leading the way on this slavery issue. Now, Lincoln himself is rather moderate in his slavery. He does not choose, he does not want to destroy slavery everywhere. He simply wants to stop it from expanding. He, along with many others, believe that slavery will eventually die on its own. It might be tomorrow, it might be next year, it might be in 30 years. He does not want to immediately declare all slavery dead. He simply wants to stop it from continuing on. And many people agree. Many free farmers in the Midwest feel that slaves will unfairly challenge the farmers' ability to ply their farming trade. But Lincoln becomes quite well known throughout the country, and he starts making trips throughout the East, giving speeches, talks as far east as Massachusetts, through New York, and elsewhere, building up a reputation for being a man who is in the forefront of the question of slavery in America. This will pay off hugely in a few years. The year after the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1859, the next brick in the wall. John Brown, that crazy-eyed guy out in Kansas, he now reappears back east some 3 years later. He has now grown a full beard. He truly looks like a prophet from the Old Testament. And his faith is still as strong as it has ever been. He truly believes that he is doing the will of God in order to stop slavery, this abomination in the country. And he comes across a plan rather close to home to the federal government. About 64 miles northwest of Washington, D.C., the government has a large armory, a warehouse for weapons. It's one of the 2 largest armories in the country, filled with cannons and rifles and all sorts of good stuff. Brown moves in, captures it. He and 22 of his men and his own sons capture the entire armory. And why not? It's just a warehouse. But they are soon approached by order of the federal government by a federal force of soldiers. And Brown and his group are holed up in this building, a little firehouse. Still stands today if you ever get out there. It's a popular site for tourism, just an hour or so north of Washington, D.C. But Brown is holed up in this firehouse as the building is surrounded by federal troops. The federal troops are led by a lieutenant colonel who is well thought of. Anybody recognize him? You will. A few years later, after he is offered command of the Northern Army by President Lincoln, he turns it down because his state of Virginia goes to the south. He will look quite a bit different, but the name is the same. Robert E. Lee. Lieutenant Colonel Lee leads the capturing of John Brown. And Brown is put on trial. They said, Mr. Brown, what could you possibly have been thinking? There were only 22 of you. You knew the federal government would not stand for it. What were you thinking? And he said, well, my thought was I'd capture as many rifles as I could, give them out to the slaves, and let them kill as many white people as they could.
Okay.
This didn't sit well with the South. The North thought he was a saint. The South thought he was a devil. The court thought he was guilty, and he was sentenced to hang. But before he hanged, he was allowed to make a final statement. And what he said was prophetic. He truly fulfilled the role of an Old Testament prophet, as he said, as my blood will be mingled with those of millions to stamp out this evil. In 1859, John Brown hanged. The country was now ready for a spark. All the tinder was in place. All the flammables were arrayed. All the people were standing ready. And the spark would come with the presidential election of 1860. Guess what? The little giant was running as the Democratic candidate. He was the leader of the Democratic Party. He should have been a shoo-in. But not so fast. Because 2 years earlier, he had upset the apple cart when he had declared that in fact the Supreme Court was wrong and slavery could not be enforced everywhere, but in fact was popular sovereignty the choice of the people. As a result, the Democratic Party in 1860 splintered into three pieces. Prior to 1860, the Democratic Party represented 60% of the populace. Splintered, not so. Douglas had the largest piece at 29%. The others, John Bell of Tennessee, and just slipped my mind. Anyway.
Tall guy, still fight man.
Gah! He was a vice president. Anyway. 29% didn't do it. So as a result, the choice was the representative for the Republican Party who won a plurality of 39%. And a man became president with less than 40% of the popular vote behind him. You might know his name. Abraham Lincoln became a plurality winning president. But the country was far, far from satisfied with the decision. Lincoln had made moderate statements. The House divided speech. I do not believe it will become one or the other. It must not be half slave, half free, but must be one or the other. It cannot stand against itself. It was not taken as a moderate stance by the South. The South declared a sectional representative has taken charge of the government, and we have no place left in this country, certainly not with that government in Washington, D.C. They have now taken over the government, and they are bound to do us harm. And for the very same reasons that the country had declared independence in 1776, the South now declared independence for themselves. The seeds of destruction had been sown over 80 years. The issue had been the division of power. Who decides on issues? The sovereign states or federal government? In many cases, this could be compromised. This could be negotiated. It played out across a subject, however, that could not be compromised. You cannot be partly for slavery and partly against. The game board was the entire United States as it developed into states, and the balance of power within Congress representing those states. Ultimately, the South believed that the election of Lincoln had tipped the scale irrevocably towards the North, and there was no place for the South to go but out. And so for those same causes that formed the country, they formed the Confederacy in 1860. Only weeks after Lincoln's inauguration, the hotbed of the South, South Carolina, opened the first volley, literally, on April 12th of 1861 as Southern forces fired upon Northern forces in Charleston Harbor and Fort Sumter, Americans against Americans, for a cause they both believed in. It would blow the country apart for the next 4 years. It had been there for 80 years. They had known about it during the writing of the Declaration of Independence. They had known about it during the writing of the Constitution. They had known about it through the expansion of the states, through the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850. They had known, they had known, they had known. They had pushed it down the road. They had kicked the can forward. They had not addressed the elephant in the room, and now it had come to bear fruit. And so it would. And in 4 years' time, some 650,000 Americans would die at the hands of each other. And the war came. Questions?
In Texas,
Yes.
I understand, if I'm correct, that when they formed as a state, they said, this is how big you are. And you can't leave again, but you can divide. Texas could still divide into as many as 5 states. Now, of course, Texas itself would lose some power, but that would put more states in the South. Was that ever considered at the time?
Well, you've got me entirely flat-footed on that.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know about that, but I will find out.
Okay.
And I can put something up on the Silversides Facebook, what I find.
Okay.
Certainly, the United States, as a nation, as a country, dwarfed those of the mother countries in Europe. All of Europe was roughly the size of New England. So it was unimaginable to most Europeans that we could be an entire country and operate. I told you that had the South won the Civil War and had they separated, I've read of accounts that had New England becoming a separate country, the Northwest, Michigan, whatnot, becoming a separate country, the far west becoming a separate country, and possibly south with Texas and whatnot. The splintering would have been devastating. At least 5 or 6 is what I've normally heard. It doesn't surprise me that Texas could have split. It's a big state. But I'll have to get back with you on that.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
What's the origin of the name Whig? Or is it an acronym?
It's not an acronym. And it's not the thing you wear on your head, because that's obviously not spelled with an H.
So there were Whigs in England, too, so it may be that they carried some of that same political view.
Well,
Political views from England.
that provides sort of an answer, but not where they got the name from.
Yeah.
Well, both questions really. You say that the term originated among English.
Yeah, I believe there were English
That sort of
Whigs.
rings a bell, but
Yeah.
other than that, was it somebody's name?
It's an odd name. It's an odd title.
Yeah.
And I'd better start writing these down.
If I'm willing to find out, I'll probably do that when I get home, just to be curious.
Lincoln, in fact, was a Whig. As he first entered politics in the 1837 timeframe, he entered as a Whig. They believed in improvements funded by the federal government for internal infrastructure of the United States, advanced railroads, better river passage down the Mississippi and other navigable rivers. He was a strong proponent of that because in his early life, he traveled many of those roads. He did travel many of the rivers. As a young man, he went down the Mississippi on a flatboat to deliver products. So he was very interested and he liked what the Whigs had to say, and they also were against slavery, so it met his bill. Lincoln was a Whig before 1854, until they got consolidated.
I think Lincoln is the only president that holds a patent. Didn't he develop something to help get that
He did.
boat from place to place?
There are falls on the Sangamon River in Illinois in which they were having trouble negotiating a flatboat over a dam. And he came up with the idea of putting all the weight at one end so it would lift up and then they could push it forward and drop it down. Anyway, he later came up with a device to do the same thing. He did hold a patent for that.
I'm wondering if, based on what you said, if the Whigs, perhaps in England, were somehow influential or involved with, as part of the larger Industrial Revolution. It sounded like they had a technical mindset.
They predated the Industrial Revolution.
Oh.
The Industrial Revolution is generally said to be 1820 to 1850. And the Whigs, as I said, John Adams, president in 1800, or in, 1798, was a Whig. So they predate that. I don't know. Now I gotta look up Texas, I gotta look up Whigs.
And can you confirm reports that I've read that John Brown's body still is a molder?
John Brown was carried back to his home in Lake Placid, New York, and it is still a popular tourist attraction to travel just outside of Lake Placid, where the Olympic site is, to visit his farm, and he is buried there. No one's checked to see if he's moldy.
Moldering, yeah.
Moldering. What else can you stump me with?
Yeah.
Probably lots of things.
It's because you get your socks on the wrong feet.
That's probably it.
I have a theory that
Come
it's
on,
not
ask us
left and
something that
right,
knocks
it's
his
Lucy
socks
and
off.
Ricky.
I've never seen socks with, and they're embroidered. Little red embroidery on the black socks, left or L and R. I'm assuming it's left and right. I purposely switched them just to see if they felt different. They don't, but that may just be my feet. I don't know. What else we got?
Any questions from the people on Zoom? It's got to be something from your brother to get at you.
I fully expect, I understand my brother and my son are both online.
They are.
And so I'm expecting sharpshooting from them. Maybe they're just being kind to me here in public and they'll get me later.
Halloween.
Bob is laughing.
Bob's laughing? Yeah. He laughed at me a lot.
Maybe he's just being nice to get a better Christmas present. I don't know.
I don't know.
So
Yeah.
I see, I've often thought of this, of Lincoln being personally an abolitionist, but having made various points along the way in his early part of his campaign for president and earlier when he was a legislator in Illinois, made clear he's saying, you know, he had no intention to try to end it.
Mm-hmm.
It'll end on its, like you said, it will die out of its own, stop expanding it and things like that. And that when he became president, the idea that he would do something to try to end slavery while he was president was not part of his plan at all.
Absolutely was not.
And in fact, he's got that famous speech about keeping the Union together and that he would do it if he had to keep slavery or not keep slavery, or keep some people slave and some people not.
I was just about...
whatever that would take to keep preserve the Union. And I think that I took this, your understanding is that with a person like Lincoln, when he became president, he was president of the whole country, regardless of who voted for him. Mm-hmm. And that country had legalized slavery. So he wouldn't have been able to do anything personally, and it would have been unethical for him to try to take a stand against one part of the people he represented on behalf of a different part of the people.
His stand throughout the first half of the Civil War was absolutely Union, Union, Union. Right. And as you rightly pointed out, in 1863 he made a statement to the effect, if I could free all the slaves and maintain the Union, I would do it. If I were to free none of the slaves and maintain the Union, I would do that also. His absolute position was to maintain the Union at all costs.
And if I could maintain the Union by freeing some of the slaves while leaving others enslaved, that too I would do.
Which of course he ultimately did with the Emancipation Proclamation. It freed all those slaves that were in territories that he could not control. Disingenuous? Not necessarily. It did change the national perspective from a rather obscure hope for reunion to one of freedom versus slavery.
Right.
And he pushed aside, or he pushed back on the Brits and the French, who wanted to recognize the South in order to get that cotton, but he pushed them back when he said, this is about slavery, and the British population was highly anti-slavery. So it was a shrewd political move that he had to do, and ultimately he allowed the freeing of slaves as a military necessity to weaken the South. Yes, sir.
And in conversations that I have with some people about this, the legal understanding of this is hard for them. But if you take it from the viewpoint that there was not two countries, United States and Confederate States. There was the United States with 11 of those states under open rebellion.
Right.
They were still part of the United States as far as Lincoln was concerned.
Absolutely.
And therefore, but they're now under rebellion, therefore they would be available to him to make dictates because they were no longer a voting block of people. They had tried to separate themselves, and so, sorry, you lose your right to vote now on this issue because of what you're doing.
Brilliant for a guy who never finished past the 8th grade. Brilliant.
We have a question from Zoomland, too.
Hey.
Was there a split in the Supreme Court during the time of the Civil War, approach the war, with some judges from the North and some from the South?
Oh, yes. And I can't quote the exact numbers. But yes, Taney gave a majority rule. It was not unanimous by any means. There were those that were against slavery. But Taney was the one who voiced the opinion on the John Brown, or the Dred Scott case. Yeah.
That was from your son.
Ah.
Did he give you a good one?
Good one. Sir.
Sorry, cotton, I presume it was not a native species, and if not, from where did it come and by whom?
Oh, it was native.
It was? It was a native?
It was
cotton,
native.
A native species?
Uh-huh.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Somebody recognized it and cultivated it, obviously.
Yeah.
He grew in other places.
Certainly, Egypt. You often hear about the guy on TV talking about the Egyptian cotton. But American cotton, Southern American cotton was considered superior to Egyptian cotton, and was well sought after by the industries both in France and England.
You know, in thinking about this today, when you put this slide up and you're talking about it was 50, when you mentioned it was 50%, 7% of the national export.
Yeah.
then you realize that as important as it was for the South, it was also important for the North. This
It
was
was.
revenue for the whole country, not just for the southern states.
Yeah. The South had an argument, but it wasn't complete in that they'd be hurt by the elimination of slavery. Certainly they would, and the country would at large. But the North was better positioned to weather it because of their industry than the South was. The South would certainly bear the brunt of abolition.
Right.
So if I can follow up on the Supreme Court question, then the ones that were from the South, when their states seceded from the Union, did that deplete the numbers that were on the Supreme Court because they were no longer part of the country, or did they?
Well, they never left the country. As we were just discussing, Lincoln made it very clear, the South has never left the United States. They are in open rebellion, and the people of the South are still Americans, and I am still their president. Those members of the Supreme Court, I don't know of any that bolted for the South. They remained in what was largely a southern city, actually. If you look at the geography of Washington, D.C., it is bounded on one side by Virginia, clearly a southern state, and on the other by Maryland, which wanted to become a member of the Confederacy. It was you might have noticed on my map, I had 4 states that were neither brown for North or green for South. They were considered border states. And Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri remained so throughout the war. Lincoln fought a very, very careful minuet to keep those states within the United States and not join the Confederacy. The largest bolting that I can think of actually were cadets from West Point. And maybe that's because of my bias, but there was a large group of cadets who, in 1861, had a farewell soiree one evening with their classmates as they left to go and join the Confederacy as their states had left. The United States at that time was not considered nearly as central to a person's individual loyalties as the state they came from. That's why Robert E. Lee, offered by Lincoln himself to be commander of the Northern forces, was finally turned down because his state, Virginia, went with the South, and he could not bear to fight against his own state. I often make the example, the anecdote, that prior to the Civil War, people used to say the United States are, because it's plural. The United States are this. But after the Civil War, it became the United States is, because the idea of uniformity, of being a single entity, was now reinforced, and would be so through the Reconstruction period as the Republicans brutalized the South into reforming as part of the United States proper and the federal government proper.
But there were legislators, congressmen and such who bolted.
Yes.
Right.
In fact,
The 14th Amendment has a provision because of those people.
Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis had been Secretary of War under Polk, and he was a leader of the Democratic Party within Congress, within the Senate. And he made an impassioned speech in 1860 saying, "Sadly, I now must leave you." And it is said that he brought many of his senator friends, both North and South, in tears as he left the chamber for the last time to go down and then be elected president of the Confederacy. So yeah, there were several that did bolt. What else we got?
Sounds like you gave us all a lot of information to think about. I know whenever I listen to you speak, I feel like I want to go look up more, learn more, go beyond that and everything. And it's wonderful. Well, I think you're still up here.
Bleeding Kansas.
Yeah.
The 2 different factions. You had Jayhawks and what were the other ones?
I don't know that the pro-slavery had a name, but they were groups that would later gain fame as raiders for the Confederacy, like Quantrell's Raiders. The James brothers were part of Quantrell's Raiders, and they would do guerrilla warfare throughout the area. They did it throughout the war, And when the war was over, they went out and freelanced, obviously, the James brothers, Jesse and Frank. But I don't know that they had a name specifically.
Okay.
You know, I might beard the lion in its den here. The question I half expected to hear from someone was, how does all this compare to today?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
I didn't want to bring it up.
We didn't know if that would start another civil war.
Yeah.
Well-
Sit here and watch the similarities.
Are we going to split up? No, we are not. The geography alone makes it nearly impossible. How do you separate out the two? Plus, I don't think there is a single unifying issue, such as slavery, that has pushed us to the point of absolute cannot negotiate.
But
Doesn't Texas?
we're so stagnant in Congress to make laws, so the state's taking care of all these things,
Yeah.
splintering everything. I mean, you can't do anything uniform. It's all state ran, and it's disturbing sometimes.
But as I always like to say during my presentations, history is not a predictor of the future by any means. It identifies trends. It is a flowing river of past events leading to today's world. And from today, we will flow on to future things, but there's no way to absolutely dictate, or identify where the flow will go. It's a little chaos theory, the butterfly, flapping its wings and what will happen downstream. We can't predict that. So I do not believe that we're in the same situation of civil war. Certainly not with the same result of brother fighting brother and splitting the country in two.
So when Texas says it wants to secede from the Union, they're just kind of talking then?
Well, I think they have it in their constitution they can't.
Yeah.
But I think that's in there. I think that's given. But nobody's going to secede.
No.
It's not going to happen. No. There's no states are going to get a sizable enough unanimity of people that would want one thing to get.
Right.
And then the cost to them would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that thought that you say that you can't compare, you can certainly look at the past, but you can't get the result of what today is going to be just because you have similarities or that
Right.
type of thing.
Right.
I can certainly appreciate that as you as a military person doing that kind of logic, using that idea that you can't. Just because it went that way one time doesn't mean it's going to happen that
Right.
way this time.
Well, it's time for the quote then. It's the Mark Twain quote. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Hadn't heard that?
Yeah,
Good one.
attributed to Mark Twain. I am not certain that he said that. But.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Well,
What
to
else
me,
we got?
To me, it sounds like people are people, no matter what era you have them in, and it just seems like you said. I mean, politics was politics, and as we learned in one of ours when we talked about the first lecture that we had here with the Battle of Toledo. Well, what do you want to let Michigan in? Well, how many electors do they have for me? No, not so many. Then let's leave them be a territory for now. And it sounds like a lot of the things you were talking about, decisions were made on what was best for the politicians. But people are people, and as long as you have that
Yeah.
constant, I think you get some similarities.
Yeah, corruption's been part of our government's, state and federal, since the beginnings.
And good people too.
And before us.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's not something that just happened here and there in spots. There's always been diligent, honest, earnest people trying to do good work, and there's always been people who are cheats and trying to skim something for themselves. And there are always people who were kind of maybe a little of both, where like I'll do good things and I might as well benefit too.
Mm-hmm.
That's always been the case. The fights over property in DC, when they first named it as the location of where the Capitol was going to be built, and there were people that were doing everything they can to control the power there. Anyway.
What a happy note to conclude on.
It's Halloween, guys.
I agree.
Anybody else? Well, once again, love having you here.
Thank you.
Love being
Thank you very
here.
much.
Yes,
Thank
very
you.
good.
Good job.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you always, Ron, for speaking here.
You bet.
Hopefully you'll come back in the spring. We can keep doing these things. It is Halloween. If anybody needs some Halloween candy for the road, feel free to reach in the bucket. And next week we'll be learning about some local Muskegon people, one from World War II, one from World War I.